The dust was thick that morning, mixing with the smell of 10,000 unwashed men who'd marched 1,000 miles. Death approached from every direction, starvation behind them, Turkish armies surrounding them, and the fortified city blocking their path. Yet within hours, the impossible would happen. To understand how we got here, we need to go back 3 weeks, when Frederick Barbarossa made a decision that would echo through eternity. Now, let me transport you to the scorching plains of Anatolia, where death was approaching from all directions. May 1190, the Third Crusade, history's greatest military alliance, was underway. While Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus sailed by sea, Frederick Barbarossa chose the overland route through hostile territory. They called him the Red Beard, and at 68, Europe's most feared warrior emperor had nothing left to prove. 40 years of warfare had made him a living legend. Yet here he was, leading 100,000 men into the heart of enemy territory. His opponent was Sultan Kilij Arslan II, the Lion Sword, master of the Turkish way of war. For 2 decades, he'd ruled the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, controlling Anatolia with an iron fist. His cavalry archers had perfected mobile warfare, striking like lightning, melting away like smoke. No Western army had successfully crossed his territory in living memory. But Barbarossa had survived 4 decades by seeing what others missed. While younger commanders saw only Turkish strength, Barbarossa noticed patterns. The Seljuks relied on mobility and arrows, avoiding close combat. Their confidence had become arrogance. They believed no Western army could endure the Anatolian furnace long enough to threaten them. The Crusaders' journey had been nightmarish. Starting with 100,000 men, disease, desertion, and constant skirmishes had reduced them to barely 15,000. Water sources were poisoned. Food supplies burned. Every mile cost lives. The Turks harassed them constantly, arrows from nowhere, night raids, psychological warfare. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion in full armor. Horses died by the hundreds. Yet Barbarossa pressed on. His subordinates begged him to turn back. The Duke of Swabia suggested retreating to friendlier territory. The Bishop of Würzburg prayed for divine intervention. But the emperor saw something they didn't. The Seljuks were overconfident. They fought the same way their grandfathers had. They hadn't adapted to the evolution of Western warfare, specifically the devastating power of disciplined heavy cavalry in concentrated formation. The Seljuk Sultanate dominated Anatolia from their capital at Iconium, modern Konya. This wasn't just a city, it was the heart of Turkish power in Asia Minor. Its triple walls had never fallen to assault. Its garrison numbered 5,000. Its position controlled the only viable pass to Syria and the Holy Land. Taking Iconium meant breaking Turkish power forever. Kilij Arslan made a fatal error. Instead of concentrating his forces, he divided them. Part defended Iconium, part shadowed the Crusaders, the largest portion. His main field army waited to deliver the killing blow once the Crusaders were fully exhausted. He believed time was his ally. Let the Christians exhaust themselves against Iconium's walls, then annihilate the survivors. But Barbarossa had spent 3 weeks observing, planning, preparing. His knights still had their heaviest armor. His men, though exhausted, maintained discipline. Most importantly, he'd identified the Sultan's weakness: predictability. The Turks always fought the same way: harass, exhaust, then overwhelm. They couldn't conceive that starving, exhausted Crusaders might attack instead of defend. As May dawned, messengers brought word. The Sultan's main army was approaching. 40,000 warriors, fresh and confident. The Crusaders were trapped between the city and the approaching host. Traditional military wisdom demanded either immediate retreat or desperate defense. But Barbarossa had survived 40 years of warfare by seeing what others missed. He would do neither. As May dawned, both armies prepared for a confrontation that would redefine medieval warfare forever. Dawn, May 17th. Barbarossa counted his forces one final time. 10,000 men remained combat effective. 2,000 knights still had war horses, though many animals were skeletal from the march. 8,000 infantry, exhausted but disciplined, gripped their weapons with grim determination. They'd lost 5,000 men reaching this point. Those who remained were the hardest, most determined warriors in Christendom. His commanders read like a roll call of German military nobility. Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, Barbarossa's own son, commanded the vanguard. At 23, he burned with youth's fire tempered by his father's wisdom. Count Rupert of Nassau led the Rhineland contingent, veterans of a dozen campaigns. Marquis of Nuremberg commanded the emperor's personal guard, 500 men, who'd sworn to die before letting harm reach Barbarossa. Each brought specialized expertise: siegecraft, cavalry tactics, infantry discipline. The Seljuk forces were overwhelming. Inside Iconium, 5,000 garrison troops manned walls that had never fallen, 30 feet high, 10 feet thick, studded with towers every 100 yards. Greek fire reserves. Months of supplies. The city's triple gate system meant even breaching the outer wall accomplished little. Approaching from the east, Sultan Kilij Arslan led his main force. 40,000 men, perhaps more Turkish sources claimed 65,000. 20,000 were elite cavalry archers, each carrying 2 bows and 150 arrows. These weren't conscripts but professional warriors who'd spent their lives in the saddle. They could fire 12 aimed shots per minute while galloping at full speed. 15,000 infantry supported them, spearmen and swordsmen to hold ground the cavalry had disrupted. Another 5,000 were irregular troops, Turkomans, eager for plunder. The Sultan's confidence was absolute. His scouts reported the Crusaders' condition: exhausted, short on supplies, horses dying daily. The temperature reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Fighting in full armor, 250 pounds of steel under that sun, seemed impossible. Turkish commanders laughed at reports of Crusader determination. What could 10,000 exhausted men do against fresh armies and fortified walls? But hidden in the Crusader ranks was a weapon the Turks had never faced at full strength: disciplined heavy cavalry operating in perfect coordination. Each knight represented decades of training. Each destrier, the war horses that remained, cost more than a village. When concentrated and properly deployed, 2,000 heavy cavalry could deliver impact force equivalent to a modern tank battalion. Then Barbarossa did something no one expected. On the evening of May 17th, he divided his forces. Military doctrine screamed against it. Splitting an inferior force invited defeat in detail. His commanders protested. Duke Frederick argued for concentration. Count Rupert suggested negotiation. But Barbarossa had learned something in 4 decades of war. Sometimes audacity succeeded where prudence failed. His plan was elegant in its madness. Duke Frederick would take 3,000 men, including 700 knights, and assault Iconium directly. The garrison, seeing such a small force, would sally out to destroy it. Meanwhile, Barbarossa would position his remaining 7,000 to meet the Sultan's approaching army. Each force was now outnumbered 5 to 1 or worse. By every calculation, both should be annihilated. The psychological warfare had already begun. Turkish riders circled just beyond crossbow range, shouting taunts. They displayed captured Crusader banners. They described in detail the fate awaiting Christian warriors. Some Crusaders wavered. Morale, already low, threatened to crack. But then Barbarossa himself appeared among the men. At 68, he still cut an imposing figure. His presence, calm, confident, almost amused, steadied nerves. "Tomorrow," he said simply, "we remind them why their grandfathers feared the Iron Men of the West." That night, Crusader priests held mass. Knights confessed sins, believing tomorrow would bring death. Infantry sharpened weapons one final time. But in the command tent, Barbarossa and his inner circle refined details. Timing would be everything. Duke Frederick must breach the gates just as the Sultan's army engaged the main force. Too early, and the garrison could reinforce. Too late, and Barbarossa's force would be overwhelmed. Hidden in the Crusader ranks was another secret. Barbarossa had kept his best knights, the 500-man Imperial Guard in reserve. Fresh horses, the last the Crusaders possessed. Full armor, maintained despite the march. These men had trained together for years, capable of forming the dreaded iron wedge that could punch through any line. On May 17th, as the sun set, Barbarossa called his son to his tent with orders that defied all military logic. Dawn, May 18th, 1190. Two Crusader columns separated in the pre-dawn darkness, executing Barbarossa's seemingly suicidal plan. Duke Frederick VI led his 3,000 men directly toward Iconium's gates. The smaller force moved openly, making no attempt at concealment. Turkish sentries couldn't believe their eyes. Were the Christians committing suicide? Barbarossa positioned his 7,000 on a slight rise 2 miles from the city. His deployment invited attacks spread thin, cavalry on the wings, infantry in the center. To Turkish observers, it looked like a desperate defensive formation. The Sultan's scouts reported exactly what Barbarossa wanted, an exhausted force preparing for its last stand. The first arrows came at sunrise. Turkish cavalry archers swept forward in their traditional crescent formation. The sky turned black with 10,000 shafts, wrote a surviving chronicler. But the Crusaders weren't retreating, they were hunting. Each knight had endured 3 weeks of this harassment. They knew Turkish patterns. As arrows rained down, they raised shields in practiced unison, creating overlapping protection. Losses were minimal. Duke Frederick reached Iconium's walls by mid-morning. The garrison commander faced a dilemma. These 3,000 Crusaders posed little threat to the walls, but leaving them unmolested invited siege preparations. Pride made the decision. Why cower behind walls when Turkish cavalry could ride down exhausted Christians? The gates opened. 2,000 garrison cavalry poured out, confident in easy victory. But the Crusaders weren't running. Duke Frederick had positioned his forces perfectly. Infantry formed squares bristling with spears. Crossbowmen, the few remaining targeted Turkish horses. His 700 knights waited, patient as coiled springs. The garrison cavalry, expecting fleeing opponents, instead hit disciplined resistance. The initial charge faltered. Back at the main battle, Barbarossa played his deadly game. Turkish arrows continued falling. A few Crusaders fell. Gaps immediately filled. The Sultan's main force was arriving dust clouds announcing 40,000 warriors. Turkish drums thundered. War cries echoed across the plains. Allah and victory. The crushing numerical superiority was obvious to all. But Barbarossa had been planning this moment for 3 weeks. He'd observed Turkish tactics throughout the march. They always attacked the same way, cavalry archers to disorder, followed by waves of attacks on weakened sections. Predictable, exploitable. He'd positioned his forces to invite exactly this approach. Turkish confidence soared. The Crusaders looked exhausted, barely able to stand. Horses that should thunder stood with heads hanging. The Sultan himself arrived, taking position on a low hill to watch his enemy's destruction. His banner green silk emblazoned with verses from the Quran announced his presence. Victory seemed certain. That's when scouts brought news that changed everything. Duke Frederick had engaged the garrison outside Iconium. The gates were open. The garrison commander, realizing his error, tried to recall his cavalry. Too late. They were fully committed, tangled in desperate combat with desperate men. Worse, Crusader infantry were advancing on the open gates. The Sultan faced a terrible choice. Ignore Duke Frederick and risk losing the city, divide his forces to relieve Iconium, or accelerate his attack on Barbarossa, hoping for quick victory. Pride and numbers drove his decision. 40,000 against 7,000, surely a swift victory. Iconium could wait an hour. What the Seljuks didn't know was that Barbarossa had been planning this moment for 3 weeks, every detail calculated. Knights' horses had been secretly given extra rations, hoarded from human supplies. The Imperial Guard remained hidden in the center, their presence concealed by infantry. Most importantly, Barbarossa had identified the exact terrain where he wanted to fight, a gradual slope that would favor a downhill charge. The Turkish attack began in earnest. Wave after wave of cavalry archers swept forward, each releasing dozens of arrows before wheeling away. 30,000 arrows in the first 10 minutes, estimated one chronicler. The Crusader line bent, but didn't break. Shields locked. Men fell. Gaps filled. Discipline held against the storm. But Turkish tactics were working. Crusader casualties mounted. Gaps appeared that couldn't be immediately filled. The wings began to buckle. Turkish cavalry pressed closer, sensing weakness. Infantry prepared to follow up, to turn disorder into rout. The Sultan's banner moved forward. Victory was minutes away. At exactly noon, 2 battles exploded simultaneously. At Iconium, Duke Frederick's knights smashed into the disorganized garrison cavalry. At the main battle, Barbarossa gave a signal. Trumpets sounded. The Crusader center opened like a gate. From within emerged 500 fresh knights, the Imperial Guard on the last strong horses in the army. They formed the ancient Germanic formation, the Iron Wedge. The Sultan, watching from his hill, felt the first chill of unease. Those weren't exhausted knights, those were fresh warriors on powerful destriers. The wedge formation was already building speed. Infantry stepped aside with practiced precision. The trap was sprung. Turkish cavalry, pressed close for the kill, had no room to maneuver. They'd been lured into exactly where Barbarossa wanted them. God wills it. The battle cry erupted from 2,000 throats as every mounted crusader joined the charge. At exactly noon, 2 battles exploded simultaneously. Duke Frederick's knights hit the scattered garrison cavalry like a thunderbolt. 700 heavy horse smashed into 2,000 light cavalry still turning to face them. The impact was catastrophic. Turkish horsemen, trained for mobility, couldn't match the crushing weight of armored knights. Lances punched through light mail. War horses bowled over smaller Turkish mounts. The garrison commander watched his careful plans disintegrate. His cavalry, caught between Duke Frederick's knights and the infantry squares, were being systematically destroyed. Worse, he'd left the gates open. Already, Crusader infantry were racing toward the entrance. He screamed orders for the gates to close, but panic was spreading. The race for the gates became a desperate sprint. Crusader sergeants, seeing opportunity, urged exhausted men forward. The gates, the gates. Turkish defenders scrambled to shut massive doors that hadn't closed in anger for decades. Rusted hinges groaned, but Crusader infantry were already there. Bodies jammed the entrance as both sides fought with desperate fury. Inside the gates, street fighting erupted. Crusaders poured through in dozens, then hundreds. Turkish civilians fled screaming. Garrison troops tried forming defensive lines, but streets designed for commerce, not warfare, worked against them. Every corner became a battleground. Duke Frederick, sword-bloodied to the hilt, personally led the push toward the citadel. The Sultan's younger brother, commanding the citadel, faced an impossible choice. His best troops were dying outside the walls. Civilians clogged every street. Fire was already spreading from overturned braziers. He ordered the citadel gates barred, abandoning the city to save the final stronghold. This decision, saving himself while sacrificing the city, would haunt Turkish morale. But then came the garrison's counterattack. Veterans who'd missed the initial sally gathered at the market square. 500 men, the garrison's reserve, charged toward the main gate. If they could seal it, trap the Crusaders inside, the situation might be salvaged. Duke Frederick, deep in the city, couldn't respond immediately. 2 miles away, Barbarossa's trap was springing. The Imperial Guard's wedge formation built momentum down the gentle slope. 500 fresh knights on powerful horses, each man and mount carrying 600 pounds of armor and weapons. Behind them, 1,500 more knights, exhausted but determined, formed a second wave. The sight was magnificent and terrible. Turkish cavalry archers, pressed close for the kill, suddenly faced their nightmare. No room to wheel away, no space for archery. The crushing weight of Western chivalry bearing down at full gallop. Some tried to flee. Others, braver or more foolish, tried to stand. Neither mattered. 30,000 arrows in the first 10 minutes. But arrows meant nothing against full plate armor at close range. The lead knights, Marquard of Nuremberg among them, lowered lances. The formation was perfect. A spear point of steel and horseflesh aimed at the Turkish centre. Behind them thundered death incarnate. The Sultan, watching from his command position, felt real fear. This wasn't how the battle was supposed to unfold. His troops were bunched, disordered from their aggressive pursuit. The Crusader charge was building speed. Desperate orders flew. Form ranks, spears forward. But Turkish military doctrine emphasized mobility, not static defense. His men didn't train for this. A young knight, Wilhelm of Tübingen, left us his account. I prayed as we charged. The Pater Noster mixed with thunder of hooves. My lance felt light as a feather. Time slowed. I could see individual Turks trying to flee. Then came impact, and prayer became screaming steel. But then Barbarossa pulled his masterstroke, the feigned retreat. Just before impact, the Crusader wings began falling back, not routing, but controlled withdrawal. The Turkish wings, seeing victory, pursued eagerly. The centre, facing the charging wedge, was left exposed and unsupported, the trap closed. The horn call that changed history came from Barbarossa himself. A single, clear note that every Crusader knew: general attack, no more defence, no more patience. Every man who could hold a weapon was to attack. The psychological impact was devastating. Turks who thought they were winning suddenly faced renewed aggression from beaten enemies. The iron wedge formation was military perfection. 500 knights in a triangular formation, each row wider than the one before. The point man Count Berthold of Nuremberg carried a lance weighing 30 pounds. Behind him, overlapping shields created an impenetrable mass. The formation was 50 yards wide at the base, a moving fortress of steel. 2,000 tons of steel and flesh, chroniclers called it. The ground shook under thousands of hooves. The sound was overwhelming thunder mixed with earthquakes. Turkish warriors, brave men who'd never fled battle, felt their courage waver. Some turned to run, others raised weapons in futile defiance. The charge covered 300 meters in 40 seconds. At full gallop, Adestria reached 30 miles per hour. The kinetic energy of a single knight equaled a modern car crash. Multiply by 500. The front Turkish ranks didn't stand a chance. Lances shattered on impact, punching through armor, shields, bodies. The crushing weight followed, trampling anything that fell. But then the Seljuk line held for 7 seconds. Elite Turkish guards, the Sultan's personal Mamluks, tried forming a spear wall. Brave men died standing. The wedge hit them like an avalanche hitting trees. Spears snapped. Bodies flew. The line disintegrated. Those 7 seconds of resistance only made the breakthrough more catastrophic. What followed was pure momentum physics. The wedge punched through, shattering Turkish cohesion. Units behind the breakthrough, seeing their best troops destroyed instantly, wavered. Panic is contagious in battle. One man running becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes thousands. Individual combats erupted across the field. Count Rupert of Nassau, his lance gone, drew his sword and carved through fleeing enemies. A Turkish commander tried rallying his men, only to be ridden down by 3 knights. Crusader infantry, seeing the cavalry break through, surged forward with renewed energy. The Sultan's standard was the linchpin. As long as it flew, Turkish forces might rally. Barbarossa himself led a charge directly at it. His personal guard Germans who'd served him for decades formed a steel fist around their emperor. The Sultan's guard fought desperately, but momentum had shifted irrevocably. When the green banner fell, trampled under Crusader hooves, Turkish morale shattered completely. Allah has abandoned us. The cry spread like wildfire. Elite troops who'd never fled threw down weapons. The Sultan himself, seeing disaster unfold, turned his horse east and galloped for safety, abandoning his army. But then, Barbarossa showed the ruthlessness that made him legendary. No quarter, no mercy. Fleeing enemies were ridden down like deer. Infantry methodically killed wounded Turks. This wasn't chivalry, this was extermination. The Crusaders had suffered too much to show mercy now. As the sun reached its zenith, 2 victories became 1 catastrophe for the Turks. The convergence came at 2 p.m. Duke Frederick's forces burst from Iconium's eastern gates just as fleeing Turks from the field battle reached the city. The collision was catastrophic. Thousands of Turkish warriors, seeking safety behind Iconium's walls, instead found Crusaders pouring out. Trapped between Barbarossa's pursuing force and Duke Frederick's emerging troops, the Seljuk army faced annihilation. What followed wasn't a battle, but an execution. Crusader knights, their blood up from victory, showed no mercy. Turkish soldiers caught between the two forces had nowhere to flee. The killing became mechanical swords rising and falling like harvest scythes. Bodies piled so high they formed barriers. Blood turned the dusty ground to mud. The slaughter's scale defied belief. Conservative estimates placed Turkish dead at 9,000. Some chroniclers, perhaps exaggerating, claimed 40,000. The reality probably fell between perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 Turkish warriors died in 6 hours. Bodies carpeted the ground from the battlefield to the city gates. Vultures would feast for weeks. Inside Iconium, the catastrophe was complete. The Sultan's younger brother watched from the citadel as his capital burned. Crusaders systematically looted everything valuable. Warehouses full of supplies, grain, weapons, gold fell into Christian hands. The legendary treasury of rum, accumulated over generations, was emptied in hours. Silk, spices, precious metals, wealth beyond imagination for men who'd been starving days before. Crusader casualties seemed impossibly light. Fewer than 500 dead, though many more wounded. The disparity was staggering. Perhaps 30 or 40 Turks died for every crusader. Medieval battles rarely saw such lopsided results. The combination of surprise, superior armor, and psychological shock had created a perfect storm of destruction. The aftermath brought touching personal moments amid the carnage. Barbarossa, his armor splattered with blood, found Duke Frederick near the palace. Father and son embraced amid the ruins, both having survived seemingly impossible odds. "You did well, my son," the emperor said simply. Witnesses reported tears on the old warrior's face relief, pride, exhaustion mixing in that moment. The sack of Iconium continued through the night. Crusaders who'd marched on a handful of dates now gorged on captured supplies. Wine cellars were emptied. After weeks of misery, the army exploded in celebration. But Barbarossa maintained enough discipline to post guards, secure key points. He knew Turkish reinforcements might arrive. The Sultan's humiliation was complete. From his citadel refuge, Kilij Arslan watched his capital burn, his army destroyed, his empire's reputation shattered. The man who'd ruled Anatolia for 2 decades was reduced to a prisoner in his own palace. Pride, power, prestige, all sacrificed to Barbarossa's strategic genius. Statistical comparisons boggled contemporary minds. In 6 hours, the Crusaders had killed more enemies than in the previous 6 months combined. They'd captured more wealth than most European kingdoms possessed. They'd broken Turkish power so thoroughly that Anatolia would never fully recover. Military historians still study the battle as an example of perfect tactical execution. The Sultan's surrender came at dawn on May 19th. Emerging from the citadel under a flag of truce, Kilij Arslan offered anything, gold, hostages, safe passage, to make the Crusaders leave. His terms were generous. 100,000 gold bezants, 500 noble hostages, provisions for the march, guides to the Syrian border. Barbarossa accepted, knowing his strategic goals were achieved. The psychological impact rippled across the Islamic world. Iconium had been thought impregnable, Turkish cavalry invincible, yet elderly Barbarossa had shattered both myths in an afternoon. From Damascus to Cairo, Muslim leaders reassessed Crusader capabilities. The Franks weren't exhausted relics, but still deadly dangerous. But Barbarossa's greatest victory would also seal his fate. The immediate consequences transformed Anatolian politics. Seljuk power, dominant for a century, never recovered. Local emirates broke away. Byzantine influence increased. The careful balance that had kept Anatolia stable shattered like glass. Barbarossa had achieved strategically what armies 10 times larger had failed to accomplish. He'd broken Turkish control of the crucial land route to the Holy Land. Then came the tragic irony that haunts history. 22 days after his greatest victory, June 10, 1190, Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing the Salef River in Armenia. Some say his horse slipped, others that his armor's weight pulled him under. The man who'd survived 40 years of warfare died in waist-deep water. His army, bereft of his leadership, largely dissolved. The greatest military mind of the age was gone. Without Barbarossa, the Third Crusade took a different path. Richard and Philip achieved fame but not decisive victory. Had Barbarossa reached the Holy Land with his veterans, history might have changed. Instead, Iconium stands as his final masterpiece, and Western Europe's last great victory in Anatolia. After this, the tide would turn permanently against Crusader ambitions in the East. The battle revolutionized medieval military thinking. Barbarossa had proven that disciplined heavy cavalry, properly employed, could overcome any odds. The iron wedge formation became standard in Western armies. The psychological impact of concentrated nightly charges was studied and refined. Iconium became a textbook example of how technology and tactics trump raw numbers. Modern military academies still teach Iconium. The principle remains valid. Superior technology and tactics can overcome numerical disadvantage. Barbarossa's use of terrain, timing, and psychological warfare predated modern operational art by centuries. His willingness to risk dividing inferior forces to achieve psychological advantage influenced commanders from Napoleon to Rommel. The philosophical questions endure. Was the slaughter justified? Did ends justify means? Barbarossa showed that warfare is ultimately about will. Whoever breaks first loses, regardless of numbers. The Turks had every advantage except one. They faced a commander willing to risk everything for victory. In war, such determination often matters more than mathematics. Leadership emerges as the crucial factor. Barbarossa's presence transformed exhausted men into world conquerors. His reputation alone was worth divisions. When he charged personally at 68, younger men couldn't help but follow. He proved that great commanders create their own luck through preparation, audacity, and iron will. The deeper lesson transcends military history. Iconium showed that impossible odds are only impossible until someone proves otherwise. Barbarossa faced starvation, numerical inferiority, hostile territory, and fortified enemies. By conventional calculation, he should have failed. Instead, he achieved one of history's most complete victories through sheer refusal to accept defeat. 10,000 men had indeed faced 40,000, and reminded the world why the Iron Men of the West were feared from Scotland to Syria. They'd proved that courage, cunning, and cold steel could still change the world. In one afternoon, an aging emperor demonstrated that history belongs to those who dare greatly, whatever the odds. Iconium's ruins still stand in modern Turkey. Visitors can walk where Barbarossa charged, touch walls Duke Frederick stormed. But the true monument isn't stone. It's the lesson that when leadership, technology, and will unite, even impossible odds become merely difficult. In one afternoon, an aging emperor proved that courage, cunning, and cold steel could still change the world.